Hello, my good friends. How are you today? May God bless you all. Imagine you're on top of the world. Money, power, a penthouse view of Seattle. But one night, in a crowded restaurant, you hear laughter that freezes time. You turn around and see two kids staring back at you. 10 years have passed, and you never knew they existed. What would you do? Welcome to a story of secrets, second chances, and a man racing to reclaim what he lost. Stay tuned, because this story is going to hit you hard. Start subscribing to our channel and commenting on what you're watching so we can get started. The rain hadn't stopped all day in Seattle, a steady drizzle that painted the city in shades of gray. It was March 2025, and Dan Carter stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse suite at the Fairmont Olympic Hotel, staring out at the blurred lights of Puget Sound. The water shimmered under the sodium glow of street lamps, a restless mirror to his own unease. In his hand, he swirled a glass of Maker's Mark bourbon, the amber liquid catching the dim light of the room. At 42, Dan had just closed another billion-dollar deal, Carter-Tech's latest acquisition of a rival AI startup, and the board was already buzzing with congratulations. But as the ice clinked softly against the glass, all he felt was a hollow ache, a void that no amount of money could fill. The penthouse was a masterpiece of modern luxury, sleek leather furniture, a marble bar stocked with top-shelf liquor, and a view that could have been ripped from a postcard. Dan's dark hair, threaded with silver at the temples, reflected faintly in the glass, and his green-gray eyes, tired, lined with stress, stared back at him. He wore a custom Nordstrom vest, charcoal gray, the kind of thing that screamed success to anyone who cared to notice. But tonight, it felt more like a costume than a second skin. He took a sip of the bourbon, letting it burn down his throat, and muttered to himself, "Another win. Another night alone." His phone buzzed on the coffee table, a sleek slab of glass and metal that never stopped demanding his attention. Another text from Mike, his assistant. "Board's thrilled, boss. Press conference tomorrow's gonna be huge. Get some rest." Rest, right. Dan snorted, setting the glass down harder than he meant to. The idea of sitting up here, pacing the sterile room while the city hummed below, was unbearable. He grabbed his coat, a waterproof Columbia shell, because this was Seattle after all, and headed downstairs to the George, the hotel's famed restaurant. Maybe a quiet dinner would drown out the noise in his head. The George smelled like cedar and roasted garlic, a warm escape from the damp chill outside. The hostess, a young woman with a practiced smile, led him to a corner table near the fireplace. Rain tapped against the windows, a steady rhythm that mingled with the low murmur of conversation and the clink of wine glasses. Dan shrugged off his coat, smoothing the wrinkles from his vest, and settled in. The menu sat unopened in front of him, steak, seafood, the usual upscale fare, but he barely glanced at it. His mind was elsewhere, drifting back to a decade ago when life felt simpler, when he wasn't just a name on a Forbes list. That's when he heard it. A laugh cut through the hum of the restaurant, sharp and bright, like a bell ringing in a fog. It stopped him cold, his fork hovering over a half-hearted bite of bread. He knew that laugh. God, he'd know it anywhere. His head snapped up, eyes scanning the room, and there she was, 3 tables away. Lauren Harper, his ex-wife, sat with her back to the window, her honey-blonde hair catching the glow of the chandelier. She looked almost the same as she had 10 years ago, elegant, poised, wearing a navy wool dress that hugged her frame just right. But it wasn't just her that made his breath catch. Flanking her were 2 kids, maybe 7 years old, their faces lit up with mischief and chocolate-smeared grins. The boy had dark brown hair, a little messy, and wore a Seahawk sweater that was a size too big. He was cutting his dessert, a slab of mousse cake, into precise squares with the focus of a surgeon. The girl, her blonde hair spilling out from under a red knit beanie, was giggling as she poked at her own plate, her energy bouncing off the walls. Dan's chest tightened. There was something about them, something in the way they moved, the shape of their faces. He couldn't place it, not yet, but it gnawed at him. Then the boy looked up. Their eyes met across the restaurant, and Dan froze. Those eyes, green-gray, sharp, unreadable, were a mirror of his own. The kid tilted his head slightly, curious, like he was trying to figure out why this stranger kept staring. Dan's gaze darted to the girl, catching her profile as she turned to whisper something to Lauren. That jawline, that smile, it was Lauren's, no question. But the pieces clicked together faster than he could process them. A puzzle he hadn't even known he was solving. 10 years since the divorce. 10 years since Lauren walked out of their Capitol Hill apartment with a suitcase and a stack of papers he'd signed without a fight. 10 years since their last night together. A blurry memory of apologies and exhaustion. His knuckles went white around the edge of the table, the polished wood creaking under his grip. Twins. They had to be twins. His twins. Kids he'd never known existed, sitting right there, eating dessert like it was any other Saturday night. The room spun, the chatter fading into a dull roar in his ears. He tried to breathe, to think, but all he could see was Lauren's face as she followed the boy's gaze and turned toward him. Her eyes widened, the color draining from her cheeks. The wine glass in her hand trembled. Just a flicker, but enough for him to notice. She whispered something to the kids, her voice too low to hear, then stood with that same calm grace he remembered from their law school days at UW. The kids glanced at her, then back at him, their curiosity palpable. Lauren smoothed her dress, a nervous tick he hadn't seen in years, and started walking toward him. Dan? Her voice was steady, but there was a crack beneath it, a thread of panic she couldn't quite hide. What are you doing here? He stood, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor, louder than he intended. Lauren? He said, his throat dry as sandpaper. Those kids, who are they? She didn't answer right away. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she glanced back at the table where the boy was still watching. His fork paused mid-cut. The girl had stopped giggling, her head tilted like she was piecing something together too. Lauren took a step closer, lowering her voice. We need to talk. Somewhere else. No, Dan said, sharper than he meant. Tell me now. Are they... He couldn't finish the sentence. Couldn't say the word mine. Not yet. Lauren's shoulders squared, the way they always did before she faced something hard. She met his eyes, unblinking. Yes, they're yours. The words hit him like a punch to the gut, knocking the air out of him. He staggered back a step, catching himself on the table. His kids, 2 living, breathing pieces of him, growing up without him for a decade while he chased deals and headlines. Anger flared hot in his chest, mixing with a grief he couldn't name. 10 years, Lauren, he rasped. You kept them from me for 10 damn years? Her jaw tightened, but she didn't flinch. You were gone, Dan. You were always gone. He wanted to argue, to yell, to demand answers, but the kids were watching now, their heads turned fully toward him. The boy's serious stare, the girl's wide-eyed wonder, they pinned him in place, helpless. Lauren's perfume, that subtle jasmine scent she'd worn since college, drifted between them, stirring memories he'd buried deep. The restaurant faded away, and all he could see was the family he'd lost, or maybe the one he'd never known he had. Hey, he said, softer now, almost pleading. I need to know them. Lauren's eyes glistened, but she held her ground. Not here, not like this. The rain outside picked up, drumming harder against the windows, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Dan's heart pounded, a storm of his own brewing inside him. This wasn't just a chance encounter. This was the night his life split open, and there was no going back. Hey, if you're hooked on Dan's world-turning moment right now, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below. What do you think about this bombshell? Should Dan fight for answers, or let Lauren call the shots? Let me know, and stick around to see where this rainy night takes us. The hum of the George seemed to fade as Dan followed Lauren through the restaurant, her navy dress swaying slightly with each determined step. The rain battered the windows harder now, a relentless Seattle downpour that matched the storm brewing in his chest. She led him to a quiet corner near the bar, where the glow of amber bottles cast long shadows across the polished wood counter. The air smelled faintly of bourbon and cedar, a mix that might have been comforting if his world wasn't tilting off its axis. Lauren stopped, turning to face him, her arms crossed tight like a shield. Up close, Dan could see the faint lines around her hazel eyes, the ones that hadn't been there 10 years ago when they'd signed the divorce papers in a sterile lawyer's office downtown. Her hair was still that honey blonde he'd loved, though it was shorter now, brushing her shoulders. She looked tired but steady, a woman who'd carried more than he'd ever realized. "Say it again," Dan said, his voice low and rough, like gravel under boots. "Tell me, they're mine." Lauren exhaled, a shaky breath that betrayed the calm she was trying to project. "They're yours, Dan. Jack and Sophie. They'll be 7 next month." He leaned against the bar, gripping the edge to steady himself. 7. The math spun in his head like a bad stock ticker. 10 years since she'd left, since that last fight in their cramped Capitol Hill apartment when she'd said, "I can't keep waiting for you to show up." 9 months of pregnancy would have followed, and then 7 years of silence. He'd been in Shanghai back then, sleeping on a hotel cot between meetings, chasing the deal that put Carter Tech on the map. And all that time, she'd been here, raising his kids. Why? The word came out sharper than he meant, slicing through the quiet. "Why didn't you tell me?" Lauren's eyes flashed, a spark of the old fire he remembered from their law school debates at UW. "You really want to do this here?" She glanced back at the table, where Jack was still cutting his mousse cake into perfect little squares, and Sophie was whispering something that made her brother roll his eyes. They hadn't noticed the tension yet, too caught up in their kid world of dessert and secrets. "Yes, here," Dan snapped, then softened his tone, catching himself. "Lauren, I had a right to know." She uncrossed her arms, her hands trembling just enough for him to notice before she shoved them into her pockets. "You were gone, Dan. Always gone. I found out 2 weeks after I filed the papers. You were halfway around the world, signing that Shanghai deal, the one you said would change everything. I called you." Dan frowned, his mind racing back through a decade of jet lag and boardrooms. "I don't remember any call." "That's because you didn't take it." Her voice tightened, edged with something bitter. "I got your assistant, Mike. He said, and I quote, 'Mr. Carter's unavailable unless it's a boardroom emergency.' I hung up after that." The words landed like a slap, cold and stinging. Mike. Loyal, efficient Mike, who'd been with him since the early days, filtering calls and keeping his schedule airtight. Dan's stomach twisted. "You should have tried harder," he said, but even as the words left his mouth, they felt weak, hollow. Lauren laughed, a short, dry sound with no humor in it. "Tried harder? Dan, I tried for years. 3 anniversaries you forgot, stuck in some conference room. Christmas Eve when you worked through dinner while I sat alone with a turkey I'd cooked for 2. The day my dad died." Her voice cracked, and she looked away, blinking fast. You sent flowers with Mike's name on the card because you couldn't even be bothered to sign it yourself. Dan flinched, the memory cutting deeper than he'd expected. He'd been in New York that week, closing a merger, telling himself he'd make it up to her later. Later never came. I was building something, he said, quieter now, almost to himself. For us. No, she shot back, stepping closer, her voice fierce but low. You were building it for you. I was just collateral damage. When I found out about the twins, I had to decide, raise them with a ghost who'd never show up, or protect them from that. I chose them. The bar felt too small, the air too thick. Dan ran a hand through his hair, the silver strands catching the light. He wanted to argue, to yell that she'd stolen a decade of his life with his kids, but her words pinned him down. He saw Jack's serious little face again in his mind, those green-gray eyes, the way he held his fork like Dan used to hold a pen, precise and deliberate. And Sophie's laugh, pure Lauren, echoing through the years he'd missed. How'd you end up here tonight? He asked, shifting gears, needing something solid to hold on to. Lauren hesitated, then softened slightly. Jack won a science fair at school, state level. He picked this place for dinner because he read about the chef in some foodie magazine. Sophie tagged along because, well, she's Sophie. A faint smile tugged at her lips, pride sneaking through her guard. Dan glanced over her shoulder at them. Jack had finished his cake and was now folding his napkin into a neat square, while Sophie was sneaking a bite from his plate, grinning when he swatted her hand away. They were perfect, messy, real, alive, and he'd had no part in it. They're amazing, he said, his voice catching. I can see you in them. And me. Lauren's expression wavered, something vulnerable flickering there before she shut it down. They are amazing, and they've been fine without you. That stung, a quiet knife between the ribs. Fine's not enough, he said, stepping closer, his tone urgent. I want to know them, Lauren. First steps, first words. I missed all of it. Don't take the rest from me, too. She studied him, her hazel eyes searching his face like she was looking for the man she'd married, not the one she'd left. It's not that simple, she said finally. They don't even know who you are. I've told them. Bits. That their dad was smart, driven, that we loved each other once. But they've never asked for more because I never gave them a reason to. Dan's throat tightened. What's that supposed to mean? It means I didn't want them waiting for someone who'd never show up, she said, her voice steady again, but her hands were still shaking in her pockets. Like I did. The accusation hung there, heavy and undeniable. He opened his mouth to respond, but Sophie's voice broke through, bright and oblivious. Mom! Jack's hogging the whipped cream again. Lauren closed her eyes for a second, gathering herself, then turned halfway. 1 minute, sweetie, she called back, her mom voice kicking in seamlessly. She looked at Dan again, softer this time. They're happy, Dan. They've got school, friends, a life. You don't get to walk in and turn that upside down because you feel guilty now. I'm not here for guilt, he said, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't name. I'm here because they're mine too, and I'm not walking away this time. She didn't answer right away, just watched him, her silence louder than the rain outside. The bartender slid a tray of drinks past them, the clink of glass pulling Dan back to the moment. Lauren took a step back, putting distance between them. We're in town for 3 days, she said at last. Jack and Sophie have a science thing at UW tomorrow. Think about what you're asking, Dan. Really think about it. Before he could reply, she turned and walked back to the table, Her shoulders squared like she was heading into a courtroom instead of a kid's dessert dispute. Dan stayed where he was, rooted to the spot, watching as she knelt beside Sophie, smoothing her hair, then said something that made Jack crack a rare smile. They were a unit, complete, unbroken, and he was the outsider looking in. The bourbon on the bar smelled stronger now, tempting him to drown the ache. But he didn't move. 10 years gone, and here he was, staring at the family he'd never known he'd lost. The question wasn't just what he'd do next. It was whether he'd ever get the chance to make it right. The next morning, Seattle woke up to a sky the color of wet concrete, the kind of gray that made you wonder if the sun had packed up and left for good. Dan sat at a corner table in a little Capitol Hill coffee shop called Analog, the kind of place where hipsters in beanies nursed overpriced lattes, and the air smelled like roasted beans and damp wool. He'd barely slept, the penthouse at the Fairmont feeling more like a cage after last night's bombshell. His vest was wrinkled now, the charcoal gray fabric creased from tossing on the couch, and his green-gray eyes were bloodshot behind a pair of glasses he rarely wore in public. He needed answers, and Lauren had agreed to meet him here, away from the kids, away from the polished glow of the George. The shop was buzzing with early risers, a barista steaming oat milk, a guy in a Patagonia fleece typing furiously on a laptop, a couple arguing quietly over a crossword puzzle. Dan barely noticed. His hands were wrapped around a black coffee, gone cold 20 minutes ago, and his leg bounced under the table, a nervous tick he hadn't shaken since law school. He kept replaying Lauren's words. "You were gone, Dan. Always gone." They stung worse in the daylight, sharper with every sip of caffeine that failed to clear the fog in his head. The bell above the door jingled, and there she was. Lauren stepped in, shaking rain off a Navy Columbia raincoat, her Dr. Martens boots leaving faint muddy prints on the wood floor. She scanned the room, spotted him, and made her way over with that same courtroom stride, steady, deliberate, like she'd already rehearsed every word she was about to say. She slid into the seat across from him, dropping a worn leather tote bag beside her, and peeled off her coat. Underneath, she wore a simple sweater, the kind of practical thing you'd expect from a Seattle mom with 2 kids and a life to juggle. "Morning," she said, her voice clipped but not cold. She flagged down a barista and ordered a chai latte, then turned back to him. "You look like hell." "Thanks," Dan muttered, rubbing a hand over his stubbled jaw. "Didn't sleep much. You?" "Same." She leaned back, crossing her arms. "Jack asked why I was so quiet last night. Sophie thought it was because she ate too much cake. They're sharper than I give them credit for." Dan managed a half smile, picturing Sophie's chocolate-smeared grin and Jack's serious little frown. "There's something else," he said, then hesitated, the weight of what he needed to ask pressing down. "Lauren, I want to meet them, properly, not as some guy staring across a restaurant." Her expression tightened, and she looked out the window at the rain streaking down the glass. "I told you last night. It's not that simple. They don't know you, Dan. I need time to figure out how to tell them without turning their world upside down." "Time?" His voice rose, sharper than he meant, and the crossword couple glanced over. He lowered it, leaning forward. "You've had 10 years, Lauren. I've had 10 hours to process this. Don't I get a say?" She met his eyes, unflinching. "You lost that say a long time ago. When I called you, really called you, 10 years back, I wasn't just some random ex-wife begging for attention. I was pregnant, scared, and alone. Your assistant shut me down like I was a telemarketer." Dan's stomach dropped. "Mike," he said, more to himself than her. He pulled out his phone, the sleek black case cold against his palm, and dialed before she could stop him. It rang twice before Mike's voice crackled through, cheerful as ever. Boss, you good? Board's asking about the press conference. Mike, Dan cut in, his tone flat. 10 years ago. Shanghai deal. Did Lauren call me? A pause, then a cautious, maybe? I'd have to check the logs. You were swamped back then, man. I filtered everything unless it was critical. Did she call? Dan pressed, his grip tightening on the phone. Another beat of silence. Yeah, I think so, Mike admitted, sounding smaller now. She didn't say much, just asked for you. I told her you were unavailable. You told me to keep the line clear, Dan. I was doing my job. Dan's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. He hung up without another word, dropping the phone on the table with a dull thud. Lauren watched him, her face unreadable but her eyes sharp, like she'd known this was coming. He blocked you, Dan said, his voice hoarse. My own damn system kept my kids from me. No, Lauren said, leaning forward now, her chai arriving but ignored. You kept them from me. Mike was just the gatekeeper. You built that wall, Dan. Every missed call, every late night, every time you chose a deal over us. I wasn't going to let Jack and Sophie grow up waiting for a dad who'd never show. Her words hit like a freight train, each one piling on the guilt he'd buried under years of boardroom wins. He saw it now, the late nights at the office while she waited with cold dinners, the weekends he spent in San Francisco or Tokyo instead of their little apartment. The funeral he'd missed, sending flowers because a merger deadline loomed. He'd told himself it was for their future, but what future was there when she'd walked out? I didn't know, he said, barely above a whisper. If I'd known you were pregnant. You would have what? She interrupted, her voice tight with old pain. Flown back from Shanghai? Quit Carter Tech? You didn't even call me after I left, Dan. Not once. You signed the papers and moved on. He flinched, the truth cutting deeper than he wanted to admit. I thought you wanted space. You said you couldn't do it anymore. And you didn't fight for me. Her voice cracked, loud enough that the barista glanced over, then quickly away. Lauren pressed a hand to her forehead, taking a shaky breath. I waited for you to fight, Dan. For months. When I found out about the twins, I realized I couldn't wait anymore. They deserved better than that. The shop felt smaller, the walls closing in. Dan stared at the coffee rings on the table, his mind a mess of regret and anger. At her, at Mike, at himself. Better than me, he said, the words tasting bitter. That's what you mean, right? Lauren didn't answer right away. She picked up her chai, cradling it like a lifeline, then set it down untouched. You were brilliant, Dan. Driven. I loved that about you once. But it swallowed you whole, and I wasn't going to let it swallow them too. He slammed his hand on the table, the sound sharp enough to make the crossword guy jump. They're my kids too, Lauren. I've missed everything. First steps, first words, first goddamn day of school. You don't get to decide I'm out of their lives because I screwed up 10 years ago. Her eyes flashed again, but this time with something softer. Pity, maybe. I didn't decide that. You did. Every time you picked work over us. She stood, grabbing her bag, her boots scuffing the floor. I'm not saying no forever, Dan, but you don't get to waltz in and demand a place you never earned. Figure out what you want, really want, and then we'll talk. She turned to go, raincoat rustling, but Dan's voice stopped her. What's the thing at UW tomorrow? The science thing? Lauren paused, half turning. It's a robotics expo. Jack and Sophie built a search and rescue bot for their school team. Starts at 11. She hesitated, then added, They're good, Dan. Really good. He nodded, filing it away. I'll be there. She didn't say yes or no, just gave him a long look, like she was measuring the man he was against the one he might be, then walked out. The bell jingled again. and she was gone, swallowed by the rain. Dan sat there, the coffee shop humming around him, but all he could hear was the echo of her words. 10 years of mistakes, and now the truth. His own empire had locked him out of the one thing that mattered. He picked up his phone, staring at Mike's last text, and fought the urge to hurl it against the wall. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The Carter Tech offices in downtown Seattle buzzed with the kind of controlled chaos Dan usually thrived on. It was mid-morning, and the glass-walled boardroom on the 30th floor overlooked a city still cloaked in drizzle, the Space Needle barely visible through the haze. Dan stood at the head of the table, his vest swapped for a fresh one. Navy this time, crisp from the dry cleaner. But his mind wasn't on the PowerPoint glowing behind him. The board was there, a dozen suits with sharp eyes and sharper questions, grilling him about the press conference he'd canceled last night. The AI acquisition was supposed to be the headline of the quarter, and now they wanted answers. "Dan, we've got investors breathing down our necks," said Karen, the CFO, her pen tapping a staccato rhythm on her notepad. "You can't just pull the plug like that without a heads up. What's going on?" He rubbed the back of his neck, feeling the weight of their stares. "Something came up," he said, his voice steady but distant. "Personal. I'll handle the fallout. Reschedule for next week. Mike's drafting the statement." Karen's eyebrows shot up, but before she could push, Mike slid in from the side, ever the loyal fixer. "It's under control, folks. Dan's got a plan. Right, boss?" He flashed that easy grin, the one that had smoothed over 100 crises. Dan nodded, but his gut churned. Mike's voice from yesterday echoed in his head. "I was doing my job." A job Dan had shaped. A machine he'd built to keep everything personal at arm's length. He glanced out the window, the rain streaking down like tears on glass, and made a call. "Meeting's over. I'll update you tomorrow." The room erupted in murmurs, but he was already out the door, coat in hand, leaving Mike to clean up the mess. He needed air, space, something to shake the fog that had settled since Lauren dropped her bomb. The robotics expo at UW was tomorrow, and he'd told her he'd be there. But how? She didn't trust him, and he wasn't sure he trusted himself. He ended up at Gasworks Park, a rusty relic on Lake Union where the old industrial towers loomed like ghosts against the gray sky. The rain had eased to a mist, soaking his hair as he walked the gravel path, hands stuffed in his Columbia jacket. The place was quiet, too early for the usual kite flyers and picnickers. Just a few joggers and a woman sitting on a bench, her red Patagonia hoodie bright against the muted greens and browns. She looked up as he approached, and Dan stopped dead. It was Rachel Harper, Lauren's older sister. "Dan Carter," she said, her voice dry as she stood, brushing wet leaves off her jeans. "Fancy meeting you here. Or not so fancy, considering you look like a drowned rat." He blinked, caught off guard. Rachel had always been blunt. Back in the day, she'd called him out at Thanksgiving for working through dessert, but they hadn't spoken since the divorce. "Rachel," he said, nodding, "what are you doing here?" "Same as you, probably. Thinking." She tilted her head, sizing him up. "Lauren told me about last night. The George, Jack and Sophie." His stomach tightened. "She send you to scare me off?" "Nope." Rachel smirked, but it didn't reach her eyes. "She doesn't know I'm here. I saw you from the trail. Figured it was fate or some crap like that. So what's your play, Dan? You gonna waltz back into their lives like some big-shot dad after 10 years? He bristled, the accusation hitting too close to home. "I didn't know, Rachel. She kept them from me." "Yeah, she did." Rachel stepped closer, her boots crunching on the gravel. "And you know why? Because you were a ghost, Dan. 3 years of marriage and she spent most of it alone. You think she cried herself to sleep after Dad's funeral because the flowers you sent were so damn pretty? No. She cried because you weren't there. Dan flinched, the memory sharp as a blade. He'd been in New York, sealing a deal, telling himself he'd fly back for the wake. He hadn't. I screwed up, he said, his voice rough. I know that now. Good for you. Rachel's tone was biting, but her eyes softened a fraction. Question is, what are you going to do about it? Lauren's tough, but those kids, they're everything to her. You don't get to breeze in and play daddy because you're feeling guilty. I'm not here for guilt, he shot back, rain dripping off his nose. They're my kids too. I want a chance to know them. Jack's science fair, Sophie's laugh. I've missed 10 years, Rachel. I'm not missing more. She studied him, her hazel eyes, so like Lauren's, narrowed against the mist. She won't, Rachel said, shoving her hands in her pockets. She's scared you'll pull the same crap you did with her. Half in, half out, always one foot in some boardroom. I've been there, Dan. Helped her raise them when she was working doubles at the law firm. Jack's got your brain. Strategic, quiet. Sophie's got your stubborn streak. They're incredible, and they don't need a dad who's only half there. Dan swallowed, the weight of her words settling deep. I'm not that guy anymore, he said, but it sounded weaker than he wanted, like he was trying to convince himself too. Prove it, she repeated, turning to go. Tomorrow. Don't screw it up. She walked off, her red hoodie fading into the mist, leaving Dan alone with the lake lapping at the shore and the old gas towers staring down like silent judges. His phone buzzed. Mike again, probably with some urgent update, but he silenced it, shoving it back in his pocket. The board could wait. The deals could wait. For the first time in a decade, something else mattered more. Back at the Fairmont, he stood in the penthouse, staring at the city below. The rain had picked up again, drumming against the glass, and he thought about Jack cutting his cake into squares, Sophie's giggle echoing through the George. Rachel's challenge rang in his ears. Prove it. He pulled up his calendar, a mess of meetings and calls, and started canceling. One by one, he cleared tomorrow. Emails to Mike, apologies to Karen, a vague promise to reschedule the press conference. His thumb hovered over a flight to San Francisco next week, a big investor pitch, then deleted that too. The phone buzzed again, Mike's name flashing. Boss, what the hell? You're tanking tomorrow's schedule. I'm out, Mike. Dan cut in, his voice firm. Handle it. Delegate. I don't care, I've got somewhere to be. Where? Mike sounded baffled, almost hurt. What's more important than this? Dan didn't answer right away. He walked to the window, pressing a hand against the cold glass, and saw Jack's serious eyes in his mind, Sophie's red beanie bouncing as she laughed. Family, he said finally, and hung up. The room was quiet now, just the rain and his breathing. Tomorrow wasn't just a robotics expo. It was a chance, maybe his only one. Rachel's words stuck with him. Don't break their hearts. He wouldn't. Not if he could help it. But as he stood there, the city lights blurring through the wet glass, a flicker of doubt crept in. Could he really do this? Could he be the dad they deserved after 10 years of nothing? He'd find out tomorrow. The Johnson Center at the University of Washington smelled like solder and ambition, a sprawling lab packed with kids hunched over robots, their parents hovering like anxious coaches. It was just past 11 on Saturday morning, and the Seattle rain had let up enough for sunlight to slant through the high windows, glinting off metal gears and tangled wires. Dan stood near the entrance, his navy vest swapped for a casual Seahawks hoodie, something he'd grabbed from a hotel gift shop to blend in. His hair was still damp from the walk across campus, and his stomach churned with a mix of nerves and hope. This was it. Jack and Sophie's Robotics Expo. his chance to prove he could be more than a ghost. The room buzzed with activity, bots whirring across test tracks, kids shouting commands, a loudspeaker crackling with announcements. Dan scanned the crowd, spotting Lauren near a table in the junior division. She wore a gray UW sweatshirt and jeans, her blonde hair pulled back in a messy bun, and she was kneeling beside Jack and Sophie, who were fussing over a boxy robot with articulated arms. Jack's Seahawks sweater was rolled up to his elbows, his dark hair falling into his eyes as he tightened a screw. Sophie's red beanie bobbed as she waved a tablet, pointing at the screen with animated gestures. They were a team, focused, alive, and Dan felt a pang of pride he hadn't earned. He started toward them, weaving through clusters of parents snapping photos, but his phone buzzed in his pocket. Mike, again. He'd ignored 3 calls already, but this time he answered, keeping his voice low. "What?" "Boss, the Japan deal's tanking," Mike said, urgency crackling through the line. "They're pulling out unless you're on the call in 15. I've got the team ready. Just say the word." Dan's jaw tightened. The Japan deal was huge, months of work, millions on the line. He glanced at Lauren, now standing with her arms crossed, watching Jack tweak the robot's wiring. "Handle it," he said. "I'm not available." "Dan, this is—" Mike started, but Dan hung up, shoving the phone back in his pocket. Too late, he realized Lauren had seen him, her eyes narrowing as she caught the tail end of the call. She muttered something to the kids, then marched over, her boots thudding on the linoleum. "You're late," she said, stopping a few feet away, her voice sharp but low enough not to draw attention. "And you're still on the phone. This is exactly why I didn't tell you, Dan. Work always comes first." "I'm here, aren't I?" he shot back, keeping his tone even despite the heat rising in his chest. "I canceled everything, meetings, press, all of it, to be here." She scoffed, glancing at his pocket where the phone buzzed again. "Sure you did, until the next call pulls you away." Before he could argue, Sophie's voice cut through, high and panicked. "Mom, the arm's not moving." She waved from the table, her beanie slipping as she bounced on her toes. Jack looked up, his serious green-gray eyes darting between the robot and Dan, curiosity flickering there. Lauren sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. "Go back to your deals, Dan. We've got this." "No," he said, stepping past her toward the table. "I'm staying." The kid's setup was a mess of wires and metal. A search and rescue bot, Lauren had said, designed to climb obstacles and grab objects. Right now, though, it sat lifeless, one arm drooping like a broken wing. Jack knelt beside it, a tiny screwdriver in hand, while Sophie tapped frantically at her tablet. "The code's fine," she said, her voice wobbling. "I checked it twice." Dan crouched next to them, ignoring Lauren's glare boring into his back. "What's it supposed to do?" he asked, keeping his tone calm. Jack glanced at him, hesitant, then answered, "Climb stairs and pick up stuff." But the servo's stuck. His voice was quiet, precise, like Dan's when he was pitching to investors. "Mind if I take a look?" Dan held out a hand for the screwdriver, and Jack paused, studying him with those eerily familiar eyes. After a beat, he handed it over. Dan popped open the bot's casing, peering at the tangle of gears and circuits. He wasn't an engineer, Carter Tech hired people for that, but he'd tinkered enough in college to spot a loose connection. "Here," he said, pointing, "this wire's off. Jack, can you hold it steady?" Jack nodded, gripping the bot as Dan reattached the wire, his fingers steady despite the sweat prickling his neck. Sophie leaned in, her tablet forgotten. "You know robots?" she asked, her tone half suspicious, half impressed. "A little," Dan said, smiling faintly. "I used to build stuff like this in school." The bot whirred to life, its arm jerking upright, and Sophie whooped, clapping her hands. "It worked! Jack, we're back!" Jack's lips twitched, a ghost of a smile, but his eyes stayed on Dan, like he was piecing something together. Lauren stepped closer, her arms still crossed. "Nice save," she said, but her voice was tight. "Doesn't mean you're in." Before Dan could respond, the loudspeaker crackled. "Junior Division, 5 minutes to testing." The room erupted in last-minute chaos, and Sophie tugged Jack's sleeve. "We gotta calibrate it, come on." Dan stood, brushing off his jeans, and turned to Lauren. "I'm not here to play hero," he said quietly. "I just want to be part of this." She didn't answer, just watched as the kids ran their bot through a quick test, its arm now swinging smoothly. But then it happened. Mid-climb on the practice ramp, the bot froze again, a grinding noise echoing from its gears. Sophie's face fell, and Jack slammed his screwdriver down, frustration cracking his calm. "Damn it," Dan muttered, kneeling again, but Lauren grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "Stop," she hissed, her grip firm. "You don't get to fix this like it's one of your deals. They've been fine without you. 10 years, Dan. You show up late, half distracted, and think you can just... What? Step in and make it all better?" "I'm trying," he snapped, loud enough that a few heads turned. His phone buzzed again. Mike, no doubt, and Lauren's eyes flicked to it, her point made. "Trying isn't enough," she said, her voice low and cutting. "You've got no idea what they need, what I've carried alone. Jack's chess games, Sophie's science fairs, I was there every time. Where were you?" Dan's chest tightened, guilt and anger warring inside him. "I didn't know, Lauren. You made sure of that." "And you made sure I had no choice," she shot back, her eyes glistening but fierce. "You were a voice on a phone, Dan, a signature on a check. I wasn't going to let them grow up waiting for you to care." Sophie's voice broke through again, smaller now. "Mom, it's not working. We're gonna lose." She stood by the table, her beanie clutched in her hands, and Jack stared at the bot like it had betrayed him. Dan pulled free from Lauren's grip, his heart pounding. "Let me help," he said, softer this time, almost pleading. "Please." Lauren's jaw clenched, but she stepped aside, her silence heavy with doubt. Dan knelt again, Jack and Sophie watching him like he was some stranger who'd wandered into their world. He tinkered with the gears, but the grinding only got worse. Something deeper was broken, beyond his quick fixes. The loudspeaker blared again. 2 minutes! Sophie's lip trembled, and Jack muttered, "We're done." Dan looked up at them, his kids brilliant and fragile, and felt the weight of 10 lost years crash down. He'd shown up, sure, but he was too late, too out of his depth. Lauren was right. He didn't belong here, not yet. "I'm sorry," he said, standing, his voice barely audible over the lab's noise. He met Lauren's eyes, saw the disappointment there, and turned to go. His phone buzzed one last time, and he didn't bother checking it. The Japan deal could burn for all he cared. He'd already lost something bigger. Dan stood in the shadowed hallway of the Johnson Center, the muffled chaos of the robotics expo fading behind him. His Seahawks hoodie clung to his shoulders, damp from the morning's drizzle, and his hands shook as he gripped the cold metal railing. The bot's grinding failure still echoed in his ears, Jack's quiet frustration, Sophie's trembling lip, Lauren's cutting words. "You've got no idea what they need." He'd tried, damn it, but it wasn't enough. Maybe it never would be. 10 years was a chasm he couldn't bridge in a day, and the weight of that truth pressed down like the Seattle sky outside. He was halfway to the exit when a small voice stopped him. "Hey, wait!" Dan turned, startled, to see Jack jogging down the hall, his sneakers squeaking on the linoleum. The boy's dark hair was messy, his Seahawk sweater streaked with grease, and he clutched a crumpled piece of paper in his fist. Those green-gray eyes, Dan's eyes, locked onto him, serious and searching. "You're leaving?" Jack asked, stopping a few feet away, his breath quick from the run. Dan swallowed, his throat tight. "Yeah, I didn't want to mess things up more than I already have." Jack tilted his head, the same way Dan did when he was puzzling out a problem. "You fixed the wire before. Why'd you stop?" "Your mom," Dan started, then caught himself. "It's complicated, Jack. I'm not good at this yet." The boy didn't answer right away. He unfolded the paper in his hand, smoothing it against his leg, and held it out. Dan took it, his fingers brushing Jack's, and froze. It was an old printout, creased and faded, a Seattle Times article from last year about Carter Tech's turnaround after a rocky quarter. The headline read, "Dan Carter's Vision Saves Tech Giant." Jack's voice was quiet but steady. "I kept this, read it a bunch. I wanted to be like you, fixing stuff, making it better, even before I knew." Dan stared at the paper, the words blurring as his chest tightened. "Knew what?" "That you're my dad," Jack said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "Mom didn't say it, but Sophie figured it out last night. She said your face did the same thing Mom's does when she's surprised, and you've got my eyes." A laugh, half choked, half disbelieving, slipped out of Dan. He knelt to Jack's level, the article crinkling in his hand. "You're pretty smart, huh?" Jack shrugged, a flicker of pride crossing his face. "Mom says I get it from you, but the robot's still broken, and we're up soon. Can you come back?" Dan's breath caught. He glanced down the hall, where the expo's noise spilled out. Bots whirring, kids shouting, the loudspeaker counting down. Then he looked at Jack, this kid who'd studied him from afar, who didn't hate him despite everything. "Yeah," he said, standing. "Let's fix it." They hurried back, Jack leading the way, and Dan's heart pounded as they reached the table. Sophie was there, her beanie stuffed in her pocket now, tears streaking her cheeks as she poked at the bot's lifeless arm. Lauren stood beside her, arms crossed, but her expression shifted. Surprise, then wariness, when she saw Dan with Jack. "What's this?" she asked, her voice tight. "Jack asked me to help," Dan said, meeting her gaze. "I'm not leaving." Sophie looked up, sniffling. "Can you fix it? It's all messed up, and we worked so hard." Dan knelt again, Jack and Sophie crowding in close. "Show me what it's doing," he said, and Sophie handed him her tablet, the screen glowing with lines of code. He scanned it, then checked the bot. Gears jammed, a motor burned out from the strain. "We need a new motor," he said, glancing at Lauren. "Any spares around?" She hesitated, then nodded, digging through a toolbox under the table. "Here," she said, handing him a small replacement, her fingers brushing his for a split second. That touch, brief, accidental, stirred something old, something he'd buried deep. Working together, they swapped the motor, Dan guiding Jack's hands on the screws while Sophie reran the code. Lauren hovered, silent but watching, her UW sweatshirt sleeves rolled up like she was ready to jump in. The bot whirred back to life, its arms swinging smoothly, and Sophie squealed, throwing her arms around Dan's neck. "You did it! Dad, you did it!" The word, Dad, hit him like a thunderclap, stopping time. Jack froze, screwdriver mid-turn, and Lauren's breath hitched audibly. Sophie pulled back, wide-eyed, realizing what she'd said. "I mean, it's okay," Dan said, his voice rough with emotion. He looked at Lauren, silently asking permission, and she gave a tiny nod, her eyes glistening. "I'm here, Sophie! I'm your dad. The loudspeaker blared. Team Rainier, you're up! That was them, Jack and Sophie's team. They scrambled, guiding the bot to the test course, a mock rubble pile with a tiny figurine to rescue. Dan stepped back, letting them take the lead, but Lauren stayed close, her shoulder brushing his as they watched. The bot climbed, stumbled, then righted itself, its arms snagging the figurine with a triumphant beep. The crowd cheered, and Sophie bounced, hugging Jack, who cracked a rare, full smile. They got second place, Lauren murmured, pride softening her voice. Not bad for a last-minute save. Dan turned to her, the noise fading to a hum. Lauren, She held up a hand, stopping him. Wait. She reached into her tote bag, pulling out a worn leather wallet, and flipped it open. Tucked behind a photo of Jack and Sophie was another, smaller, faded. Dan and Lauren at their UW Law School graduation, arms around each other, grinning like the world was theirs. I kept this, she said quietly, even after everything. I never stopped believing in the old you, the one who cared more about us than deals. Dan stared at the photo, his throat burning. I lost that guy, he said, but I'm finding him again. For them. For you, if you'll let me. She didn't answer right away, just closed the wallet and tucked it back. They'll want you around now, she said finally. Sophie's already calling you Dad. Jack's halfway there. But it's gotta be real, Dan. No assistants at their games, no emails during dinner. I promise, he said, and this time it felt solid, not just words. I'm in. All in. Later, back at the Fairmont penthouse, Dan stood at the window, the city lights sharp against the night. His phone was off. Mike could wait. The Japan deal could wait. He'd emailed the board that afternoon, stepping back from day-to-day ops, delegating to focus on what mattered. Jack's article lay on the coffee table beside Sophie's beanie. She'd left it behind, a quiet gift. Tomorrow, he'd meet them for breakfast, then Jack's Little League game. Small steps, but real ones. Lauren's voice echoed in his mind. I never stopped believing in the old you. Maybe she was right. Maybe that Dan had been there all along, buried under ambition and regret. Success wasn't the skyline out there, the headlines, or the billions. It was Sophie's hug, Jack's trust, Lauren's guarded hope. It was family, messy and imperfect, and he'd spend every day earning it back. He pressed a hand to the glass, the cold grounding him. 10 years lost, but a lifetime left to build. For the first time in a decade, Seattle didn't feel like just a city. It felt like home. And there it is. Dan's journey comes full circle. If this ending hit you in the feels, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. What's your takeaway from Dan, Lauren, and the kids? Can second chances really heal a decade of hurt? Let me know. Share this story with someone who needs it. And thanks for sticking with us to the end.